Hi everyone, just going to show you a game that I played a few days ago, and it's quite interesting because the game was more or less won in the opening. Came out of the opening better, but also my opponent used up a lot of time, and this factor proved crucial later on. So I was black, my opponent opened with e4 and I played the Sicilian, knight f3 d6, open Sicilian, knight f6, he played bishop b5 check. Now quite often you'll see knight d7 here, as d7 is a common square for the knight, from which you can go to c5 and it keeps an eye on the e5 square as well, and you might see something like knight c3, a6, kicking the bishop back, queen to c7, protecting his c6 square, because later you want to play b5 and then bishop to b7, and black's pieces develop very nicely. But instead I played bishop to d7, and after the exchange we saw knight c3 of an e6, looking to play bishop to e7. White castles, and then I play the bishop to e7. And if we hadn't had the bishop to b5 move, and we just had knight to c3, I'd have played probably a6 for Najdorf. And I could have played a6 instead of bishop to e7, but there's nothing wrong with the bishop move either. But after bishop e7, my opponent played his ninth move, knight d to b5, simply threatening to take on d6 and win a pawn. And if he takes, it's going to be check, and after the bishop recaptures and the queen takes, I'm not going to be able to castle straight away. And in this position I play knight c5 and the d6 pawn is defended, and I'm threatening to win the pawn on e4. White plays a natural move, rook to e1, guarding the e4 pawn. I had to consider the line a6, knight takes pawn check, bishop takes, and then e5, forking the knight and bishop. But after bishop e7, pawn takes and bishop recaptures, black's fine. Instead, in this position, I just castled kingside. Now white played what looks like a logical move in b4, and it kicks the knight on c5 back, knight to d7. Now if white takes on d6, and we get queen to b6. If the knight goes to c4, just get queen takes pawn, attacking both knights. Queen comes to protect. The f rook comes to c8. Bishop a3, queen takes knight, few exchanges. Bishop takes e7, and now we see why it's the f rook. It's no longer going to be attacked on f8. Rook takes, and we're up a piece. And in this situation, if we've got e5, then we just get knight takes e5, rook takes, bishop takes, rook e1, lining rook up against queen, threatening bishop takes h2 check, queen goes out of the way, and then we can tap the knight and c3 with the rook, bishop protects and bishop takes pawn, and white's down on material, he's going to lose some more. So white doesn't take here. So he plays bishop f4, attacking the d6 pawn 3 times. It's only defended once, but after knight e5, the knight blocks the bishop's view of a pawn, and the queen's protecting it as well. And if he was to take the knight with his bishop, then we just get pawn takes, and now we've got the threat of a6 winning material. His knight will only have a3 to go to, and then bishop takes b4 is attacking both knights. And it'll be pinning the knight on c3 to the rook on e1 as well, so we can add more pressure with the rook on c8. So he doesn't take the knight, and he plays his bishop to e3, which is a mistake. He should have left the bishop where it was and instead play something like the rook to b1, protecting his b4 pawn, which is going to become a weakness. So now we're getting a6, and black's better on the 13th move. My opponent fought for ages here, and then he played his knight to a3, which doesn't look great, but if he played it to d4, then we'd have got d5, and I'm threatening to win the pawn on e4, the pawn on b4, and I've got the d5 break in, so any exchanges in the centre are going to give me a very free position. So knight a3, and I play the queen to c7, getting my queen off the d file, and at the same time threatening the knight on c3, which he defends with bishop to d4. And in this position I play a move that cramps his position quite a bit, b5. Now the knight a3 can only go to b1, but more importantly it stops him playing b4 to b5, which would really free up his position. So b5, and again my opponent had to think for a long time on this 1/16th move. He plays his knight back to b1. Again, notice that if he took on e5, if he took my knight on e5, then after pawn takes, there's no way of defending both the knight on c3 and the pawn on b4. I noticed that these double pawns are very good. This one controls the d4 square for my pieces, and white can't use a d5 square because I've still got a pawn on e6. My opponent protects the b4 pawn, a3, although the computer showed that a4 was a more active option. So rook a to c8, queen to d3, and I play rook f to d8. That's the 18th move, and my opponent was very short on time now, and he played a bit of a howler, f4, and e5 was a response here. Now I've got a winning advantage already. He can't take the pawn. If he takes a pawn, I recapture with a d pawn, attacking his bishop, and this rook will be pinning a bishop as well, so win material there. Now what he needed to play here was bishop f2, and then I take this pawn. But he's playing very quickly, and he played a natural looking move, bishop to e3, protecting the pawn. But now comes knight takes bishop, queen recaptures, and then knight to g4. And now notice that the white queen can't stay anywhere along that diagonal safely, and I'm threatening queen to b6 with check, forming a well-known mating pattern. My opponent plays queen to f3, guarding this f2 square. If he doesn't guard the f2 square and plays queen to c1, and we get queen to b6 check, has to go to h1. If it goes to f1, we get queen f2 mate, knight f2, king has to go back to g1, knight to h3 double check, so the king has to move. Again, he can't go to f1 because of queen f2 mate, king h1, and then we get the queen sacrifice, queen to g1. King can't take because it's guarded by the knight, rook takes, and then knight f2 mate. But of course with the queen guarding that square, the queen would just capture the knight. So that's why here he plays a queen to f3. And we see queen check anyway, king to h1, knight f2 check, king to g1. And here I played knight to d3 check. And the best move is just queen in away, queen's exchanged, rook takes, and knight takes f4. And black's a pawn up and with a much better position. For instance, if white plays something like knight to d2, then we get rook takes, knight takes, winning a piece. Instead of knight to d3, the computer preferred knight takes e4, queen's exchanged, knight takes, and then d5. But I think my opponent didn't want to trade any more pieces, and certainly didn't want the queens off the board. He probably thought he needed the queens on if he was going to get anything out of this game, and he plays a king to f1. I'll take the rook, king recaptures, and then a queen comes in now with decisive effect, king to d2. When I played pawn takes on f4, which wasn't the strongest move, but white's going to have a difficult time now finding any decent move, and he takes on f4. He was short of time, but this makes things much easier. Queen takes on g2 check, king to d3. He's got to be careful not to go on one of these black squares, otherwise bishop to g5 will pin the queen against the king. Bishop to g5 anyway, and he played queen to g3, looking to trade off the queens, but this runs into mate in 3. Queen f1 check, knight e2, queen to d1 check, and here he resigned as he's only got one move available, knight to d2, and then queen takes his mate. So there's a big help there with my opponent getting into time trouble, but he got into time trouble because of the difficulties in the opening, and I think it's a good demonstration of how black's position in the Sicilian defence has got a lot of potential, and pieces that look like they're cramped on the second and third ranks can suddenly spring into life. So there we go, hope you got something from that, and thanks for watching.